Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm delighted to welcome you today in this RegAgri webinar entitled Developing Sustainable Food Systems in EU Agriculture. My name is Gaia Giorgiofedi. I'm Communications Manager at Safe Food Advocacy Europe, the Brussels-based NGO ensuring that European consumer interests stay at the core of EU food legislation and specialized in health, environment, and inclusion. Before I give the floor to my colleague, Antoine Daz, let me remind you that this webinar is being recorded and it will be uploaded on the Safest YouTube channel. We should have a Q&A moment at the end of every session, if we have time, hopefully. Otherwise, at the end of the presentations. Let me tell you that only the questions introduced via the Q&A option on Zoom will be answered. So I invite you to use that option in order to interact with our speakers. Now I give the floor to Antoine Daz, EU Projects Manager at SAFE.
Thank you very much, Gaia. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to this webinar. Thank you for your interest, and thanks in advance to all our panelists for attending the session today. As Gaia said, this event today is brought to you by Safe Food Advocacy Europe and the RegAgri for Europe Erasmus Plus project. We are delighted to welcome the European Commission as well as other experts to be talking today about the challenges and opportunities found in today's agricultural systems in the EU. As all of you know, numerous reports over the years have highlighted how current food systems cannot really provide a sustainable answer to the challenges of food security, food safety, or the access to healthy and affordable food in Europe. This has been even recognized by the European Commission, by the way, behind the important communications that have been the Green Deal and most notably the Farm to Fork strategy. It's still probably needed to recall that the current food systems contribute hugely to deforestation, to biodiversity loss, to soil depletion, to health crises. The industrialization and the hyper-globalization of agriculture make our agriculture in Europe a fragile system. And we are currently experiencing that in the Ukrainian war, or we have been seeing that in the COVID-19 crisis. These are consequences of fragile, unsustainable food systems, and these consequences are dire. They affect the lives of dozen million people in the EU who face food insecurity, with the most vulnerable groups being children and women, and they're extremely exposed. But we're not really going to talk exactly about that today. We're going to talk about the good side of things, so the good news, because this otherwise dark painting still has hope in it. We can choose otherwise. We can choose ambitious policies that aim at shifting the paradigm towards the change in food systems that would promote diversification of food produced in the EU, produce quality food, healthy food for the benefit of all consumers and citizens of the EU. We would love to hear about DG Santé's and DG Agri work on sustainable food systems. As you know, the legal framework is currently being explored by the European Commission. And we're at SAFE very, very, very hopeful, and we believe that this can happen. This is attainable. But we have to make sure that these food systems will provide easy access to environmentally sustainable and healthy diets for all citizens, including all disadvantaged groups. And in this framework, we believe regenerative agriculture is one of the elements that can help us. Regenerative agriculture responds to all these issues that have been mentioned before. It's a conservation and rehabilitation approach to farming systems. that focus on topsoil regeneration, that increase biodiversity, that improves water cycle, that supports biosequestration and increases resilience to climate change. So today we're very glad to welcome all experts and policymakers, because we want to bring them together and explore what is being done at policy level to support a transition to sustainable food systems. And we also want to show how best practices can be developed and provide practical solutions for farmers to transform the food production systems and the agricultural landscapes in the EU. So without further ado, I think I will give you the floor back, Gaia, for our first speakers. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the webinar.
Thank you, Antoine, for your introduction. Now I'm pleased to introduce Henri Delange from the European Commission, Deputy Head of Unit at RegAgri. Mr. Delange, the floor is yours. We cannot hear you, sorry.
My apologies. So thank you for inviting me to this webinar. And what I would like to do today is to talk to you about the Organic Action Plan. Next slide, please. So officially, this is called the Action Plan for the Development of Organic Production. It was adopted last year, 25th of March, and it was adopted in support of the achievement of the targets related to organics that are embedded in the Green Deal strategies, the Farm to Fork strategy, the biodiversity strategy. Next slide, please. So, of course, and it was already mentioned in the introduction, we have this overarching umbrella of the Green Deal adopted in 2019, and then two strategies that are very important from a point of view of organics. We have the Farm to Fork strategy, the biodiversity strategy, and they both include this target of achieving 25% of EU agriculture under organic farming by 2030, as well as a significant increase in organic aquaculture. Now, this is an important target for the Commission because, of course, organic farming has all of these positive environmental, soil, water, biodiversity, animal welfare effects. And also because if you look at all of the targets in the Farm to Fork strategy on pesticides, fertilizers, antimicrobials, any increase in organic farming will have, of course, a positive impact on the achievement of those targets. Now, this 25% target is a very ambitious target. We are currently at 9.1%. And if you would extrapolate current trends, we would achieve something between 15 and 18%. So the target is up to 10% higher than what you could normally expect. And of course, very challenging are the very different starting points for the member states. So we have some member states that currently are at 0.5% of organic farming when you look at total agricultural area, for instance, Malta. And we have member states that have already achieved the 25%, for instance, Austria. Next slide, please. Luckily, this action plan, it doesn't come out of the blue. It doesn't stand on its own. So it's very important to look at it together with the new organic legislation that has entered into effect this year and which provides legal stability for farmers and operators that want to convert to organic production. We will also, for the sake of the Organic Action Plan, be able to benefit from substantial financial incentives. So I will return to that in a moment. We have the Common Agricultural Policy. We have the Research and Innovation Framework Program, Horizon Europe. We have the Agricultural Promotion Policy. We can also build on a growing public recognition of the EU organic logo. So for the moment, across the EU, 61% of respondents to the Eurobarometer survey, they know the EU organic logo. And also we can build on a high level of trust in the organic logo. But there are these challenges, of course. I've already mentioned the different starting points of the member states. And of course, also in organic production, there's always the risk of fraud. Very important, because if we want to grow the sector, of course, consumer trust is everything. Next slide, please. Well, before I walk you really very quickly through the action plan, just taking a step back and looking at the horizontal features of this action plan. So it's a very comprehensive action plan. We tackle the issue of increasing consumption, increasing production, further enhancing the sustainability of organic production. But it is first and foremost demand driven. So it is really the first axis you will see of the action plan is about consumption, because that is the most sustainable incentive for conversion. Farmers, operators will not convert to organic production unless they will see an increasing demand for organic products. It's also an action plan that is comprehensive in two ways, or two other ways. First of all, it involves the complete private value chain, so from the farmers all the way down to the restaurants, and also it involves public stakeholders at different levels. So we have actions to be taken at EU level, at member state level, also at regional, local level. I've already mentioned Horizon Europe, so the action plan assigns great importance to research and innovation. And in fact, 30% of the budget for research and innovation actions on agriculture, forestry, and rural areas should be directly or indirectly relevant for organic production. And then I've already referred to the CAP and to Horizon Europe. So the action plan benefits from a number of EU programs, but there are also other financial tools more at member state level that are very important, for instance, green public procurement. Next slide, please. Just to emphasize the point that we really want member states to develop a comprehensive approach towards organic production. And we see there are two important tools at member state level. On the one hand, for everything that concerns agriculture and rural development more narrowly, we have, of course, the national strategic plans under the Common Agricultural Policy, and I will mention later on a bit more about that. And on the other hand, we invite member states to develop complementary national organic action plans. So to cover everything that has not to do with agriculture, rural development in a narrow sense, for instance, issues like green public procurement. Next slide, please. So just very quickly taking you through the action plan, just to give you an idea of the structure of the action. So as I mentioned, this action plan takes a demand-driven approach. So the first axis is really about stimulating demand for organic products while maintaining consumer trust. Next slide, please. And then the first priority is really informing consumers about the environmental, economic, social benefits of organic farming, to do so via events, to do so via the information measures under the Common Agricultural Policy, and of course, also regularly measuring consumer awareness of the EU organic logo. Next slide, please. Then we have more proactive agriculture promotion. So we have a dedicated budget for agriculture promotion. Now, 1/4, more or less, is now reserved for the promotion of organic products. This year, this is about 50 million. And that's, of course, very important to use this budget in the EU, also in third countries. But under this promotion angle, we also have issues like, for instance, the creation of an EU Organic Day. We have celebrated that this year for the second time. The creation of EU Organic Awards. We have handed them out this year for the first time. Next slide, please. Still under demand, we have green public procurement. This is really very important. We see this as an important source of possible demand for organic products. If member states, regional, local authorities, they procure organic food for their schools, their hospitals, nurseries, elderly homes, the army, prisons, and so on. That's, of course, very important to develop further the organic sector. Next slide, please. And a bit in the same line is the EU school scheme. So the Commission supports, or the EU supports, the distribution of fruits, vegetables, and milk products in schools. And also there is a review going on, and we want to explore a larger share for organic products there. Next slide, please. I have already referred to this importance of maintaining consumer trust, and you see here a number of measures that relate to that. So this is everything that has to do with fighting fraud, increasing our collaboration with Europol, with the European Public Prosecutor, with OLAF, which is the Commission Anti-Fraud Agency, reinforcing controls on imports at the border, and so on. Next slide, please. Closely related to that, because that's a very important issue in organic production, is that we want to ensure full traceability. So from the farmer to the final consumer, there should be for each product full traceability. We want to further strengthen that, amongst other things, via the creation of databases of operators, digital signatures of documents, and so on. Next slide, please. And then this is the final action under demand. This is really working very closely together with the private sector via different ways. And one of them is the Code of Conduct for Responsible Business and Marketing Practices, food business and marketing practices. The first version of this Code of Conduct was adopted last year, and it already contains some references to organics. But of course, in future versions, we would like to strengthen those references, all for the sake of enhancing the availability, the affordability of organic products. Next slide, please. Then we come to the second axis, which is about increasing the supply of organic products. Next slide, please. And there, of course, the first important issue is ensuring that there is an important place for organics in the national strategic plans for the Common Agricultural Policy. So this is a process that has been going on this year. All of the member states have submitted draft national strategic plans. We have looked at the level of ambition in those plans, whether the allocated budgets were commensurate, whether the interventions make sense. And we have provided feedback to the member states. They have revised, and we are now in the process of the adoption of all of these plans. So that has been very important. Next slide, please. So just to make sure, or just to inform you that this is the CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy, is not just about providing financial support. It's also about advisory services, technical support, and for instance, issues like demonstration farms, exchanges of best practices, and so on. Next slide, please. Then still in the logic of supply, we feel it's very important to enhance the transparency of the sector. And therefore, we want to enhance the availability of statistics so that all of the actors in the sector, they have all the information they need to make the right decisions. So this is price information, for instance, the prices of organic versus conventional products, but also statistics on production, on trade, and so on. Next slide, please. What is also very important is that in the further development of the organic sector, we want to make sure that there remains a strong place for the farmers, so that in their negotiations with processors, with wholesalers, with retailers, they have a strong position so that they can secure a fair income. And therefore, we are exploring ways of forming or joining dedicated organic producer organizations. Also, another priority is fighting, of course, unfair trading practices. Next slide, please. Another issue related to organic production is, of course, that every actor along the value chain needs to be certified. Now, this is there's a cost involved. There's also a certain measure of administrative burden involved. So therefore, we now have included in the legislation this possibility of group certification, which should reduce the cost, the administrative burden. So we also want to promote that. Next slide, please. Another priority is the promotion of what we call biodistricts, and also the promotion of short supply chains. So biodistricts is where public authorities, tourism authorities, organic operators come together to develop joint initiatives. So this is a concept very much pioneered in Italy, but which we want to promote across the EU. Next slide, please. Still in the second axis of supply, there are certain bottlenecks in organic production, which we want to overcome. One of them is animal nutrition. So we want to look into solutions there, on the one hand, via research and innovation projects, but also by exploring the possibility of feed based on insects, for instance. And also there is an algae initiative on the table. So these are different ways in which we want to address this bottleneck of a lack of animal protein feed. Next slide, please. And then, I mean, not to forget, of course, that the farm to fork and biodiversity strategy target for organics is about land-based farming, so the 25% target, but also about increasing aquaculture, organic aquaculture. So also there we have a number of actions. Also there you will have national strategic plans, research innovation actions, and so on. Next slide, please. And that brings us to the third axis. So organics is already ahead, let's say, in terms of sustainability, but we want to enhance its sustainability further, because of course, certain issues are not covered by the organic legislation: energy use, water use, for instance, the issue of plastics, packaging. So it's important that also there, the organic sector progresses. Next slide, please. So you see actions like setting up a pilot network of climate positive organic holdings. Next slide, please. Then there is research innovation on seeds, and also on the very important issue of yields, of course, because the comment that is often made is if you promote organic farming, which has lower yields, you are endangering food security in Europe. So it is, of course, important that we also focus on how we can improve yields in organic production. Next slide, please. Another issue is in organic production, there are still a number of contentious inputs, what we call them. For instance, copper. So of course, it's very important we find alternatives to those contentious inputs, also for plant protection. So also there we have a number of research innovation actions. Next slide, please. Then organic production already leads the way in terms of animal welfare, but we feel we can always do better. So also there we will explore ways to further increase animal welfare. And then the final slide, please. And this is the issue which I have already mentioned. One issue is packaging plastics. So there is the adoption foreseen of a framework on bio-based, compostable, biodegradable plastics. And also there are actions that focus on, for instance, consumption of water and energy. And I end here. So I've tried to give you a little bit, well, maybe just a final slide here, just to tell you that it's not just a plan. Implementation is fully ongoing, because indeed we have these annual information measures under the CAP. We have already these annual promotion actions. We have created the Organic Day. We have created the Organic Awards. We have debated several times already with the member states on green public procurement. The review of the school scheme is ongoing. We have reviewed the national strategic plans under the CAP, and so on. So just to tell you that implementation of this action plan is really ongoing. And then I end here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Delange, for this beautiful presentation, for outlining the Organic Action Plan and describing the European Commission commitments in this field. Now I'm pleased to present Alice Pignacca, also from the European Commission, Policy Officer at DG Santé in the Farm to Fork unit. Mrs. Pignacca, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So this afternoon, I'm going to talk about our legislative framework for our EU sustainable food system. Next slide, please. So as you know, in May 2020, the European Commission has adopted the Farm to Fork strategy. And with this strategy, we put forward 27 actions. I just, here in the slide, we have some examples of the type of actions that we proposed. So revision of current legislation, non-legislative acts such as Code of Conduct, and the action plans, and new legislative proposals. And here I really want to highlight that, of course, the Farm to Fork strategy and all the actions that are being implemented do not happen in a vacuum. Of course, there is a big synergy with other policies, be it the Common Agricultural Policy, or, for example, also the Common Fishery Policy and Research and Innovation. Next slide, please. So let's say what we call the flagship initiative of our strategy is the framework legislation on a EU sustainable food system. So what is the objective of this framework? Well, the overarching objective is to ensure that all foods placed on the EU market increasingly become more sustainable through a socially responsible food value chain. And here we really take the sustainability approach that we take in the Farm to Fork strategy, that is to consider sustainability from its three point of view, so economic, environmental, and social. And this is really translated in the work that we're doing on the framework legislation. And also here it's important to highlight that we're adopting a systemic approach in this with this framework legislation. So we really want to address all actors of the food system. So we're also shifting from only food chain approach to a food system approach. And then also really this framework would set the foundation for the systemic changes that are needed by all actors, and also will promote policy coherence at the UN national level, mainstreaming sustainability in all food-related policy and strengthening the resilience of food systems. Next slides, please. So why do we need a new framework legislation? Well, here in this slide, I just summarized 3 main problems that we have nowadays for our food systems. So, for example, the long-term viability and resilience of the food system is compromised. Making healthy and sustainable choices remain too complicated, and the union regulatory structure of the current food system does not support a sustainable union food system. And next slide, please. So let's now dive in, let's say, in the various problems that we are encountering. So, for example, the long-term viability and resilience of the food system. As it was mentioned in the introduction, actually, our EU food system alone transgresses several planetary boundaries. We are transgressing climate change, for example, and the use of fresh water, and also the use of nitrogen and phosphorus by several times. So we really need a change, a strong change, a committed change in how we approach our food system and how we deal with the food system. And also, speaking about food system sustainability, of course, a sustainable food system cannot be a food system where the food is wasted. So now roughly 20% of the food produced in the EU ends up wasted. And European diets are not in line with the recommendation that drives obesity and diet-related health issues that also have a big impact on the environment, but also on our society for health-related costs. And well, we also this past year the main biodiversity and climate crisis with droughts, floods. So really there is a need for a change. There is a need to ensure that our food system is sustainable, and that will also help us ensure long-term food sustainability, but also long-term food security as well, of course. Next slide, please. So the second problem is that making healthy and sustainable choices remain too complicated. As a matter of fact, we see like that despite the proliferation of claims and labels, the sustainability-related food information is still not comprehensive. It's still not clear for majority of consumers, and is also not really clear what, for example, what sustainability aspects are highlighted, and well, the truth behind these claims and labels. And also, we have seen that the Eurobarometers shows that European consumers and citizens are willing to switch to more sustainable options, but we see that the costs, taste, and food safety are the main factors that are influencing Europeans' food purchases, and also these are the main barriers that prevent consumers to switch to more sustainable choices and options. And also, of course, the food environment has a big impact on how consumers make their choices, because this food environment is largely driven by commercial forces, creating demands through intensive food marketing and catering for consumers' preferences. So really this food environment as it is right now doesn't really foster for sustainable food choices. And well, with the Farm to Fork strategy, the Commission has well put forward that in a sustainable food system, the healthy and sustainable choice should be the easy choice for the consumer. Next slide, please. And finally, from the regulatory point of view, we can see that the union regulatory structure of the current food system does not support a sustainable union food system because we don't have regulation or like a legislation that really addresses the sustainability of the food system as a whole, as for example does the general food law for the safety of food, because we have different policies regulating different parts of the food system. So we have the common agricultural policy, the common fishery policy, general food law and other initiatives. And some of sectorial legislation, of course, address some parts of sustainability, but none of them does it as a whole with a systemic and holistic approach that we're trying to achieve with this legislative framework. And also we have a big governance challenge as well, because well, while the EU, of course, can play an important role in the sustainability of food system, member states also need to play an important role, also because the EU cannot act everywhere without competencies. So of course the member state level is very important in this transition. Next slide, please. So in this slide, we have a bit like the main objectives that we want to achieve with the framework legislation. So as we said, we have a general objective, so setting the foundation of systemic changes, and then we have different sub-objectives, let's say, so strengthening the resilience of the EU food system, facilitating sustainable and healthy choices, and mainstreaming sustainability in all food system policies and operations. Next slide, please. So how do we get there? So we're currently working on the impact assessment of the framework legislation. And well, the framework legislation we aim of having different elements of the framework legislation. So for example, we'll have common definition, because it's very important that we set, let's say, the same bar for everyone, so that we understand what we talk about. Everyone has the same definitions. And then we will also have general objectives to be pursued vis-a-vis sustainability of the food system in all future union and national law. So we really will anchor with this framework legislation the objectives of the farm to fork strategy. And then we will also have a general principle targeting policymakers as well, as I said, at the EU and national level. And then governance provision, as I said, to overcome this problem of governance with member states, and also provision about a favorable food environment and monitoring and enforcement provisions. Next slide, please. Of course, as I said, we are taking a systemic approach, so the framework should have the broadest scope possible, so as to ensure a common understanding and application of established concept across the relevant legislation and food system policies, and to provide the foundation upon which sectoral legislation can be further built. So really, we try to cover like the largest scope possible. Next slide, please. Actually, can you go 2 slides further? Yep, push measure, perfect. Yes, that's perfect, thanks. So in this framework legislation, we will have different measures. So we have the so-called push and pull measures. But so what is the objective of the push measure? Push measure would mainly aim at addressing the problem that food or feed business operator do not systemically take sustainability consideration into account while designing their operations. So that will has negative environmental, social, and economic impacts on all actors involved. Therefore, with push measures, we will impose responsibilities to increase compliance with sustainability standards, and then maybe also control choices available to consumers through the removal from the union market of less sustainable food operations. As you can see on the slide, we have several policy options that are being considered. So of course we have the normal option 0, option 1, so do nothing or voluntary approach, and then we have different options which are which can be also combined. So for example, we have option 2 with the review and alignment of sectoral legislation through requirements in line with the FSFS objectives or principle. So we will put, yeah, exactly. The sectoral legislation would be aligned to the scope of the framework legislation. Option 3, we have increased compliance with sustainability standards by explicitly establishing the primary responsibility of economic operators. So it's a strengthened or enhanced due diligence for sustainability purposes. And then option 4 would be the removal or elimination from the union market of the least sustainable food system operations by setting minimum sustainability requirements based on the do no harm principle. For this option, we have 2 sub-options. So option 4A is only for food produced in the EU, and option 4B would also cover imports. And finally, option 5, as I said, as the options are not mutually exclusive, option 5 is a combination of option 2, 3, and 4. So if we can go back 2 slides, please. Okay, so I presented the push measure, but while the push measure will reduce the operation that are manifestly unsustainable, it doesn't mean that everything that is allowed on the market is sustainable. So with the pull measure, we would, let's say, indirectly make processes that are sustainable more attractive for economic operators and consumers. So for example, we have the sustainability labeling. This is really addressed to consumers and also to help them to make a sustainable choice. So the aim will be to accelerate the transition to a sustainable EU food system, enabling the consumers to make sustainable food choices and stimulating consumers' demand for sustainable food. And this will incentivize food business operator to progressively improve the sustainability of the food products. So also for this pull measure, we have different options on top of do nothing and voluntary. We have, for example, option 2 with the provisions developed for sector-specific legislation, or a general framework for sustainability related information for consumer for all food, and then a voluntary harmonized EU sustainability label, or a mandatory harmonized EU sustainability label. And also in this case, in option 4, we have either covering only EU food products or all imported food products. Next slide, please. Yes, and another measure, another pull measure is sustainable sustainable public procurement. So with this pull measure, we really want to ensure that the market as a whole moves towards more sustainable operations. And well, it was mentioned also before by my colleague Henry, and that also this public procurement, sustainable public procurement part of the framework legislation will also support of course, the organic production. So also here we have different regulatory options. And option 1, for example, is voluntary, and this would mean the extension of the green public procurement guidelines to cover the 3 dimensions of sustainability, in particular healthy diets, but in this case, no legislative action would be foreseen. Option 2, general provisions and requirements would raise awareness and improve skills and knowledge on public procurement. And finally, option 3 would mean a mandatory general and specific requirements. So it would mean an introduction of a general sustainable sourcing obligation, for example, or more empowerment also to the Commission to adopt delegated and implementing acts that will specify sustainable public procurement criteria. Next slide, another one, please. Yes, governance. And finally, as I mentioned before, there is an issue with not an issue, but of course also governance needs to be addressed. So the framework would aim at providing a frame for a multi-level cooperation for food system actors. So it would really lay down appropriate processes and arrangements to enhance and frame multi-level cooperation, engagement and public participation, both at the EU, member state and regional and local level. And also, it will provide a basis for the development of food sustainability strategy by member states. Because as I said before, the EU doesn't have competence in acting in all areas that need to be addressed to achieve the transition to sustainable food system. Let's take for example, education. If we want to tackle education at a national level to foster also the transition towards sustainable food system, we need the support of member state. And this national strategy would be regularly reviewed, and the performances would be monitored via monitoring framework. And finally, I would just want to pass through the consultation activities. Of course, we have been following all the better regulation steps. So as I said, we are now working on the impact assessment, but from end of April to end of July, we have we had open public consultation with quite good number of responses, also from a lot of citizens. We had a workshop with European Parliament, Economic and Social Committee, Committee of the Region, and relevant EU agencies. And also we organized targeted stakeholder consultations with interviews, targeted surveys, stakeholder workshop, and also an SME survey that actually was closed. I didn't update the slide. It was closed on 30 October. So yeah, here really to show that well, the Commission, we have really listened to, been listening to the views of stakeholders, and all the views of stakeholders are very welcome and will be taken into account in our work on the impact assessment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Pignacca, for your interesting and insightful presentation on the Farm to Fork Action Plan and its approach and its challenges. Now it's my pleasure to introduce you to Mr. Tim Forslund from Citra. Mr. Forslund is an expert in circular economy and environmental policy. Mr. Forslund, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gaia. I hope you will enable me to share the screen, and I can share it from my end if possible. Or I can, yes, excellent. So thank you. I can't see myself on the screen, but I also can't navigate the through this, but hopefully you see me and hear me.
We can see you.
Okay,
we can
excellent.
see you, and actually we are sharing the screen, so you might just say next slide, please, and
yes,
we will deal
Thank you.
with that.
Thank you, Gaia. And I would like to thank you for the invitation as well. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I would also like to acknowledge the two previous speakers on RegAgri and Sante. I think it's a very important point from Alice Pignacca is that we need to look at the food system at a systems level, and here the EU has a really central role to play, and that's also what I want to talk about here today from the Finnish Innovation Fund's perspective, and how we see the role of the circular economy in building that circular food system in line with our planetary boundaries. So, and I think there are two parts of that, as you can see from my name here on the slide. Firstly, we need to make sure that it is regenerative. Secondly, we need to make sure that we get as much value from the products and the food that we have. So on the next slide, I would just mention that why I'm here today is I'm from the Finnish Innovation Fund, and we are a Think, Do, Connect tank and a future fund and a future house of Finland. So our role is to think about what a sustainable future can look like, and we work on different topics from fair use of data, democracy, lifelong learning, and of course how we can tackle the sustainability crises as a whole. And next, I would mention there in that context that next I would mention. Can we see the next slide, please? That Finland has worked on this for some time with what how we can look at the circular economy, the climate change, and biodiversity, and how we can see that as a whole. And especially in the circular economy, Finland led the work with the world's first circular economy roadmap in 2016. And the food sector was one of the sectors, and we have looked with exploring what is the role of circular procurement and finding the right circular indicators with Statistics Finland. So there have been a lot of stakeholders involved, more than 1,000 stakeholders. And I could also mention that as a follow-up to this, education has played a really important role. That 3 years ago, Finland had the highest number of learning offerings in circular economy in the world, not just per capita. So we see this as really important, that we need to train people. And here, it's not just about university, but also about lifelong learning. So people in their work life, how can they, what role can they play? And as one example, we have one of the courses that we have seen from Finland looks at how a circular economy, what role it can play in designing more sustainable and circular food products. And thirdly, it's also about supporting businesses, because they play a crucial role in the transition. And I would also mention that we can try things in Finland, but Finland is a really small country. So if some of our ideas are successful, we will also have to share those at a global stage, where we in turn can find solutions that also work in Finland. So unless we have that kind of global exchange, our impact will remain limited. But next, I would mention that this roadmap, it was a really broad process. It had more than a thousand people, and it looked at four key sectors in Finland, food being one of them. And next, I can see what you can see what the food. Next, you can see the sustainable food system being a really important part of this. And we had some pilots as part of this. So, for instance, we looked at regenerative farming. How can it also help to meet our climate goals? So looking at carbon farming in Finland. So this was a really important pilot that we have also continued to work on regenerative agriculture, and also looking at the role of food that would otherwise be wasted, and can that be used in to meet social needs in the city of Vantaa, that is close to Helsinki, as well, through the Shared Table initiative. Next, I would just mention this pilot with carbon action farming, and then we have continued to also fund a pilot where it's essentially an e-learning course in both Finnish and Swedish, where farmers, we try to find what are the best practices that can work in Finland. So to help train the farmers to see how they can learn more about this, to support both crops and carbon sequestration and biodiversity outcomes, and also build more resilience. And next, I would mention the role of businesses again, that is really important. And I will give a few examples, but we have compiled a list that you can find on our website where you can check out all of them. But I'll give a few examples. Next, you can see, for instance, one important solution is from Raisio, and they produce something called Beanit, which is an alternative protein company. And I think there are many alternative protein companies across the world, but what they do is that they use local fava beans from Finland, so they don't need to import soy. And it also goes hand in hand. Often these things are talked about separately, alternative proteins and regenerative agriculture. But what is interesting about this example is that they also make sure that this is these are looked at together. So providing with the ingredients from Finland through regenerative agriculture. I would also mention another example on the next slide in terms of food waste. As mentioned, previous pilot has looked at from a social perspective, how we can make sure that no one goes hungry, also in Finland. Linked to this, there's another company that provides a solution by bringing food products to people's doorsteps, food products that would otherwise be wasted. So if we can reduce our food waste in line with the circular economy, we also need less food products in the first place. Next slide, I would mention the company Ecoland that has been acquired recently by Yara. And I think this is an interesting example, because they use byproducts from bioenergy production. So it's thinking, how can we get as much value from our biomass as possible? And what they do is that they produce binders in cement, and they also look at how they can improve soil structures through these byproducts, and also providing nutrients to the soil at the same time. And This, of course, works best when it's done in tandem with, for instance, crop rotation and other practices in line with regenerative agriculture. Next, I could also mention what we have done at Citra besides just the business side. We also need to think about how can we solve these crises at the same time, and we need numbers, we need data for that. And one approach we have taken through our work is to work with partners to find the role of the circular economy in tackling both climate change and biodiversity. So we have published two studies. So one as part of group of organizations back in 2018 looking at the climate mitigation potential, and more recently in May this year we published a study tackling root causes, where we see if we shift towards regenerative agriculture, if you use more alternative, diversified and more alternative sources of proteins, and we cut food waste, where can we get? And we looked at the 4 sectors with the biggest impacts on biodiversity. So next, I could share a few things about what this looks like. So we know if you continue as before in Europe, we will, and at a global level, we will continue to lose biodiversity past 2050 and beyond. But if we look at producing and consuming products and food in a more sustainable way, we can also bend the curve, and we can do it quite fast. Already in the next decade, we can begin to halt the decline. So taken together through the textiles and buildings and forests and food and agriculture sectors, we can effectively do this. And next, I would share some of the key findings from this study. So the good news is that the circular economy can halt and even begin a small recovery back to 2000 levels of biodiversity by 2035. And we see here that the largest, as you could see from the previous slide, the largest contribution comes from a circular food and agriculture sector. And in particular, this is due to the shift away from animal-intensive protein sources to more diversified sources, and also including the role of reducing food waste, and regenerative agriculture also plays a role. And the good news here is also that the same measures can be used to tackle climate change. We could, for instance, reduce 90% of methane emissions at a global level, not in Europe, but at a global level through these same interventions. And we could also, in Europe, meet the LULUCF, the updated LULUCF targets by 310 megatons of carbon dioxide by 2030 already. And this also, if we use fewer resources, we are also less exposed. We are also, we can have a stronger security of supply in Europe, so we can also increase our resilience. As one example, in our scenario, we make possible a 30% reduction in nitrogen fertilizers, which goes a little bit beyond the farm, beyond farm to fork. So the report thus confirms that to tackle the triple crisis, we need to really shift to a circular economy. Then we can tackle both climate change, biodiversity, and at the same time pollution, and build resilience at the same time. So next, I can just also mention one more key finding, that we often talk about this in Europe, but in fact, most of our biodiversity impacts are still outsourced to other parts of the world. And even if we, for instance, reduce food waste in Europe, that is fantastic, but some of those benefits would accrue to other regions, in particular in Southeast Asia, Latin America, and Sub-Saharan Africa. So we need to address biodiversity loss at a global level, because it is essentially a global problem. And here the new legislation on deforestation related to supply chains plays a really important part. But circular economy also plays a complementary tool by reducing the total demand at the same time, because even if we ensure that Europe's supply chains are greened in a way, we also need to make sure that the overall consumption pressure goes down. Otherwise, we're not going to solve the pressure, as the pressure on nature will simply shift elsewhere. Next, I would just share some key implications for what a sustainable EU food system would look like. And as mentioned, we should make sure that when we talk about the sustainable food system, that the circular economy is used as a key tool in delivering that. And then the coherence with the circular economy action plan and the bioeconomy strategy are also really important. Most of our scenario looks at biomass, and as the bioeconomy progress report has shown, there's a 40 to 70% deficit between available biomass in the EU by 2050 and actual supply. So we just don't have enough biomass, and the demand is going up. So we need to make sure that we get as much value out of our biomass as possible. And the food system is absolutely critical in enabling this shift, that we stop reducing, that we stop outsourcing our impacts, and we drive biodiversity outcomes also in Europe. So here, the circular economy is a really important tool to deliver that, to give us more value from what we have. And secondly, I mentioned the role of moving away from animal intensive protein sources, that they will continue to play a really important role, but we also in Europe need to reduce our consumption of meat. And here it's also a growth market that I see some promising rivalry between. For instance, China has also mentioned the potential of these proteins in their latest 5-year plan. And I think the concept of an EU protein strategy has a lot of promise, but here we have to make sure that we talk about proteins for human consumption as well. And we also see in the Sustainable EU Food System Initiative that the public procurement plays a really important role in creating a market for these proteins. And we see also countries, some member states are already investing in this, as France and Denmark have already done. So we need to continue to drive this shift, because it's a massive market opportunity as well. Thirdly, and finally, we also need to make sure that while we can reduce our resource consumption, the pressure on nature, we can also make sure that we drive biodiversity outcomes in areas under production. So here it's about how we produce in ways that are more regenerative. So we need more research, and we also have to continue to support farmers in different member states to find what are the practices that drive regenerative outcomes in different member states in optimal ways, because in different member states we have different climatical conditions that we need to take into account. So we need to really find what are the optimal ways we can enable this. So to conclude, we don't have much time, so we need to make sure that we help solve as many crises at the same time as possible. And here, a circular food system is absolutely central. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Tim, for explaining how circular economy can really contribute to the creation of more sustainable food systems. Thanks to all our speakers. Now we have our Q&A session. We already have some questions, and I invite the audience to use the Q&A button if you have questions.
Shall I reply on the organics questions, or?
Yes, please. Go ahead.
Yes. Okay. So I saw there are 2 questions on organics. So on the first question, on this X, very important and very useful question, very relevant. The X, organics, land use, and meat consumption. So of course, we are not for the moment proposing 100% of organic production. So for the moment, the target is 25%, and then it has to be seen, of course, whether we reach that target. We're currently at 9.1%. But this whole issue of increasing the availability of organic products, increasing organic farming, has to be seen in conjunction, and I think that's also implied in the question, with a number of other issues. Of course, the first issue that determines land use when it comes to organic production is the issue of yields itself. So as I've tried to explain in the presentation, we are working on yields in two different ways. So first of all, we want to make sure via technical support, exchanges of best practices and so on, that all of the farmers operate at the current frontier so that they really achieve the yields that are possible at this very moment. The other thing is to work more in depth in a structural manner and to have research and innovation actions on increasing yields more structurally. So that's the first thing. We work on yields directly via best practices, and then more in the long term via research innovation. Then this has to be seen, of course, also in conjunction with the issue of waste, the fight against waste. Because if you say organic yields are 20 to 40% lower, but 20% of all of our food is wasted, then of course the problem is already of a different scale. But then third, very correctly, is important, this issue of dietary change. The reasoning being that if you reduce meat consumption, you have to dedicate less land to feed production. You could use that land for other purposes, including organic production, of course. And that's, of course, is an important issue that is currently being debated. It's debated in different fora. To give you one example, it is currently being debated exactly within the context of the discussions with the member states on the agricultural promotion policy, where the whole discussion is, should there still be EU funds for the promotion of meat production? So just to tell you that this issue of yields is extremely important, the whole interaction with land use, but that you have to look at it from different angles, and dietary change is definitely one of them. Then there is another question on how can we involve or increase the involvement of retailers, wholesalers, processors. This is, of course, a very important question. Indeed, as I have mentioned, we work for the moment through the Code of Conduct. It's a little bit the same discussion as for green public procurement. Can you impose certain percentages? This is very complicated given the very different state of development of organic production in different member states. As I say, it ranges from 0.5% to now, I believe, 26% in Austria. So what we see is the best incentive for processors and wholesalers and retailers to convert to organic production or to take it seriously is that they see the increasing demand for organic products. And that's why we work on two fronts. We work on increasing private consumption, and that we do via educational measures. So we start young already via the EU school scheme, which does not only involve the distribution of fruits and vegetables and milk products, but also includes educational activities. And then we have these information measures and we have these promotion measures. So that's on the private side. And then we have the increase in public demand, where also the value chain can respond to via green public procurement. So this is for the moment the two avenues we are promoting, let's say, to increase the involvement of wholesalers, retailers, as well as processors. Thank you.
So I see we have another question for the European Commission from Mr. Delange. What is the main obstacle related? No, sorry. From Marina Teixeira, is regenerative agriculture also being addressed by EU targets? It was mentioned 25% organic production target by 2030. Is there a target for regenerative agriculture too?
So the most explicit target is, of course, for organics, but there's often a bit of a misunderstanding. It is not that we have the promotion of organics and that the rest of the agriculture, so to say, conventional agriculture, remains the same. Also there, we have under common agricultural policy, of course, higher requirements, and there is also support for agroecological practices and so on. But there are no numerical targets there. So there is a numerical target for organics, but at the same time, of course, we aim to increase the sustainability of the non-organic agriculture as well. But there is no specific target for instance, regenerative agriculture or agroecology. There are no numerical targets on that.
Thank you. I have a question for Tim Forslund. What is the role of civil society organizations in the development and implementation of EU policies for the development of sustainable food production?
I could give one example from Finland. It's a very good question. And I was mentioned again when Finland started the roadmap work with the world's first circular economy national roadmap in 2016. There were more than 1,000 stakeholders involved. So it was not just policymakers and a few businesses, but also labor unions, NGOs, and universities of applied sciences as well. So it's about bringing different people together and creating that vision and identifying which steps are actually feasible that we can get buy-in in from, and then using the relevant expert agencies, for instance, with metrics and procurement. One of the pilots that I mentioned was around carbon farming in Finland. And for instance, with the Baltic Sea Action Group, they are, of course, really interested in looking at the health of the Baltic Sea, which suffers from eutrophication. So there's too much excess nutrients. So this course that I mentioned is with, you could call a civil society organization that has helped carry out this course, which Citra has funded. Because even if we say, for instance, that we need to reach these regenerative outcomes, they will be different in different countries. We can not have exactly the same approaches to reaching these regenerative the outcomes might be similar, but the ways to get there might be different, and we still have to understand better what is a more regenerative agricultural system, so they can play a really important role in finding in different member states how can we get there. So I think that's the one example from Finland.
Thank you. Now I would like to ask Alicia Pignacca to answer on a question on how to improve the consumption of organic or sustainable food products. So specifically, what could be done to increase the awareness and the engagement of all the players in the value creation chain?
Thanks. Yes, I mean, of course, as I mentioned before, and as it was mentioned before, we have the EU Code of Conduct on Responsible Food Business and Marketing Practices, which, of course, is a voluntary approach, but at the same time, it has been developed by the Commission together with the industry, and it's also very clear that there might be legislation in case there is not enough progress. And this actually is a process that has brought together a lot of players in the industry, the middle of the chain, but also we have a farmers organization that were that are signatories to the Code of Conduct. We have NGOs, so that's already a first step. And then, of course, in the legislation as well, as I mentioned, we have we could have national strategies at the member state level. So, of course, that could play a role also for education of people. As we said, also we have the youth school scheme, but education can play a very important role. And then we also have, of course, food information to consumers that is very important. And that's why it's also very important that, for example, the sustainability label is clear and it really informs consumers on what it means to be sustainable. And it is clear and it doesn't, let's say, pass wrong information. And that's also why it's very important that, yeah, we work on that. We create a label that is clear, but it's also linked to the communication and to the education that is made also at member state level.
One more question. Is the EU protein strategy looking into how to increase the consumption of alternative proteins for humans and going beyond to devote more land or sea in case of algae for livestock feed?
Is this for me? I have to say I'm not an expert on EU protein strategy, so I will have to ask my colleagues. I cannot give you an answer today. I'm sorry.
Maybe Henri might answer.
No, I must say I'm not really following that one either, so I'm sorry. But, yeah.
Okay.
Maybe I could mention that it's a wish that it will go in, but we don't have a protein strategy really, to be clear. So I think that is a wish that it should go in, but we don't know yet, I think is fair to say.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thank you to our speakers and to our audience. We are now calling for a small break. We will be back in 6 minutes. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending our webinar. We are back from break. And before I give the floor to our next panelists, I would like to say that there was a question before about the CITRA report, and Tim Forsland answered by giving the address where you can read this report. So if you wish to read it, you can check on the Q&A button among the answered questions. Thank you very much. And our next panelist is Laura Dorn from CEFA International, coordinator of the RegAgri for Europe Erasmus Plus project. Hi, Laura, the floor is yours. Maybe Laura is not ready yet. Sorry, just a few minutes. Hi, Laura. If you're ready, the floor is yours.
Okay, can you all hear me? So, thank you so much for having me. Today I will present you the RegAgri for Europe project, which is an Erasmus Plus project. Next slide, please. So, yeah, my name is Laura Dorn. I work for CEFA International, which is a German consulting company. And yes, we are the applicant and also the coordinator of the Erasmus Plus project RegAgri for Europe. The complete title would be Upgrading the Agricultural Sector with Skills in Regenerative Agriculture. Next slide. So yeah, just a few words about the project framework. So as you know, it's funded by the European Commission. We have applied for Key Action 2. So it's a strategic partnership in vocational education and training and adult education. And it has a duration of 24 months. So it started end of December 2020 and it will end end of this year. Okay. We are a project consortium of 7 partner organizations. Among them is SAFE. We have mostly partners from Germany, Greece, and Belgium. So we have Schloss Tempelhof, and Maya is here also representing this permaculture farm here in Germany. We have an IT partner working for us for developing a virtual learning environment. And we have in Greece, we have the Agricultural University of Patras and AMC, also a VEC provider. And we have ACRIN in Germany, which is an accreditation body, so certifying courses and curriculum. Next slide, please. So, but now coming to the main objective, or why we do this RegAgri for Europe project. And this is basically to design an innovative vocational curriculum on regenerative agriculture, providing farmers and apprentices skills and knowledge to implement sustainable cultivation methods. And therewith, we would like to give impetus to transform agricultural practices and landscapes. And how do we achieve this, or how do we try to achieve this? By implementing or realizing, providing 4 basic results. We have called them, or they are called intellectual output. So O is intellectual output. We have started within a status analysis on like where does regenerative agriculture stands today? What is the definition? How is it perceived on the educational level, on the policy level, but also on the market demand level? And then after this, we have developed the training program. So this is really the core result of our project. We have provided, or we have developed reading material. We have developed recordings, so lectures, video lectures, handouts, presentations, quizzes, etc. And this is all the RegAgri for Europe training program. And then as a next step on intellectual output number 3, we have created a virtual learning environment. So where everyone who's interested can go and can see all what we have developed. So the whole training course we have put on the virtual learning environment. And then as final intellectual output number 4, we have also certified the course, and this was thanks to the accreditation body I have just presented before, AGRI here in Germany. They have officially certified and accredited the RegAgri for Europe course. And this is just to give you an overview. We have divided the course into 6 lectures, starting with background, context, insights into RegAg, then going in lecture number 2 to the reasons and principles behind RegAg. So what are the methods, what are the key principles? Also key principles of permaculture are located here. And then we have RegAg in practice 1, 2, and 3. So we have shown how to really practice regenerative agriculture on the field, and have presented some methods, which with regards to vegetable production, to agricultural production, and to other practices for larger scale implementation. And then as a final lecture, we have benefits and potential of RegAg for the environment, society, and human health. So there we just clarify a bit more in detail why we do this, what are the benefits, and what are also the challenges, so economic aspects of transforming farms. Thank you. And then I said, as one major result, we have the virtual learning. So this is really a learning environment where everyone can access for free. And here they find those lectures, and they can click, or they can access each lecture. And each lecture is presented in a similar manner. So we have the video tutorials, we have then the reading material and the presentations, we have forum discussions, we have quizzes just for like self-learning checks, and then we have a final exam. And if the learner has successfully completed everything, then he or she can also download the certificate. And the certificate gives, the proof that the learner has participated, has completed the course, and it also has the stamp of this certification, which we received by AGRI. The whole course is available in English, German, Greek, and French. So it's not only the course content which is provided in the various languages, but also the learning surface. And everyone can register for free. I have put the link. I assume you're going to share the presentations later on, so everyone knows how to access the course. Okay. this is just an impression. This is Maya having a lecture on carbon sequestration potential. So this is just to show you what the videos look like. So we have the presenter in front. We have the course, the presentation as a slide presentation in the background, and the learners can choose the language displayed. So all the videos are in English, but then subtitled in the various languages. And then one more highlight from the RegAgri for Europe course was the 5-day seminar, and this was for the top 30 learners of the RegAgri for Europe course. So we have offered them the opportunity to stay at the farm Schloss Tempelhof in Germany, and for 1 week from Monday till Friday they had courses, like additional courses in the seminar house, but also on the field, and they have seen firsthand how to implement regenerative agricultural methods. And they were all like accommodated at the Schloss Tempelhof farm. Here you see just a few pictures. So there on the left side we have Schloss Tempelhof, and then again Maya on the field explaining to the learners how to implement regenerative agricultural practices. And if time allows, I wanted to show you a follow-up project, because now we have or are successfully concluding the RegAgri for Europe course, but then during the course of the project, we had so many more ideas and how to develop further some of those ideas and products we have provided or we have created in the RegAgri for Europe course. And that's why I decided with some of my colleagues to apply for another Erasmus Plus project, and this was then accepted, and we have just started in October with the climate farming Erasmus Plus project, and the whole title is Holistic Resource Management for Climate Resilience of Farming. It's also in Key Action 2, Cooperation, Partnerships in Vocational Education and Training. And here our objectives are to develop and conduct climate adaptation and mitigation communication to transform agricultural enterprises to become more sustainable and climate resilient. Also, we train professionals, so vet educators, trainers, farm advisors, farmers, to become climate adaptation and mitigation agents. And as a final objective, we want to inform vet authorities and policymakers about climate change adaptation and mitigation options in farming. So here it's also obviously the focus on education, but much more on like really transforming within the time span of 30 months of project duration to transform those participating farms and to implement climate adaptation measures during the project itself. And then by showing how this successfully works, also giving this information and knowledge to other interested people and parties. And this I just wanted to point out, because this is now the follow-up project, and if anyone is interested also in the upcoming months and years, we will be working on climate farming project. So yeah. If you have any question, I mean, I'm here now, but you can also visit the website. There you also find my email address and phone number. So I'm happy to get in contact with all of you.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you for presenting this beautiful project in which we also believe a lot. And now I'll give the floor to Maya Eilman from Schloss Tempelhof, who is also a partner of the RegAgri for Europe Erasmus Plus project. Maya is farm manager, head of nursery, vegetable breeding projects, greenhouse production and employee coordination, and also instructor for trainees in vegetable production. So Maya, the floor is yours.
Great. Can you all hear me? Lovely. Yeah, after my lovely introduction, I don't need to reintroduce myself. I wanted to, in this short presentation, give a little bit of kind of a case example for a working regenerative farm and kind of explore the potential that farms have for implementing regenerative principles. And one thing that was before the break in the discussion already mentioned that I think is really important to keep in mind is that every farm is going to have to find their context-specific solutions for implementing regenerative agriculture. And so I think much more important is to look at what are the wished results and then finding really context-specific solutions for finding those or creating those results. So a little bit of farm context. We are located in southern Germany, our farm, Baden-Württemberg, and we're about 500 meters from sea level and have about 700 milliliters of water or rainfall every year. And we're on 32 hectares, and we're a very small diversified farm, kind of a dying race of farm that hopefully through the regenerative movement will become a growing farm movement to have small diversified farms, because what we've really realized is that there's so much potential for small regenerative farms that are diversified in that they don't just have one crop. In our case, we have an integration of animals, grain production, green manure, vegetables, all in one, as well as tree structures. And so creating all that unique ecosystem within 32 hectares really enables us to kind of look at where can we close energy systems and be as efficient with our energy as possible in form of kind of creating farm on-site fertilization, etc. I've set up the structure of this presentation. I've broken down into 4 almost like farming philosophies that guide our practice. And the first one is to kind of always keep the ground covered. And these farming philosophies are also regenerative principles we implement regardless of whether we are talking about vegetable production or grain production. And keeping the ground covered is kind of one of the core principles, because it really it helps to mitigate erosion on a large scale. It helps us, especially in the last very dry summers. It really helps keep moisture in the soil, which is where moisture belongs, and it helps to protect the soil life. So the more we learn about kind of our soil life, is that the soil life is really dependent on having a certain amount of moisture and darkness in order for it to thrive. And the more it's kind of dries out on the surface of the soil, the less soil life we will find. And this is, on the other hand, this is kind of a big challenge, I'd say, in annual vegetable and grain production, because for annual, which makes up by far the vast majority of our vegetable and grain production at this time, is that we annually have to plant new roots. And so we are forced to kind of create a seed bed, which then typically, is then planted and left for open cultivation. And so large parts of our soil are left without ground cover for the majority of the year or season. And one strategy that we have been developing over the past years, also in collaboration with a few other innovative farms in Germany, is mulch planting systems. And so as can be seen on this slide, and we'll go to the next slide, is what it looks like when a crop is planted directly into a mulch layer. So this shows kind of this example of a very useful technology that has been created for mulch planting systems, and that is a mulch planting machine. So this planting machine enables us to first prepare our beds to be planted, then spread a layer of mulch. And in our case, we use pasture. So we use cut pasture. And instead of making hay out of the pasture, we spread it over the beds where the vegetables are going to be planted for that year. And then we can, with our mulch planting machine, we can directly plant into that mulched layer. So this is, we're setting cabbages right now. We can look at the next slide. We'll see this is what it looks like later in the season when the crops on the one side we have the red cabbage, on the other side we have celery growing in the mulch layer. And what's very noticeable is there's pretty much no barren soil. So throughout the entire season, we've managed to cover the soil, even at the point in time where the crop itself hasn't taken up much space. We have protected soil, we have kept the moisture in, thus needing much less resources in form of irrigation. And also mulch serves as a wonderful fertilization substitute. And for us, it's also a great on-farm substitute because we have pasture land, and that our own pasture land then goes onto the beds and fertilizes our vegetable crops. Let's move to the next slide. So the next principle is about maximizing plant diversity. And maximizing plant diversity is, there's been many studies in the recent years showing that the above ground plant diversity is directly related to the below ground microbiology diversity. So kind of like we as humans don't want to just eat corn, even though we eat way too much corn. We like to have a diverse diet that keeps us healthy, gives us the micronutrients that we need. And that's the same for our soil life. Our soil life really appreciates a diversity of root exudates, which only can come from a diversity of plants. And so this is one example on the photo of a green manure. In the next slide, we'll see another example of a thriving, diverse green manure with, or a cover crop with many different components. The more, the better, is kind of our philosophy. The more diversity for cover cropping, the better. And that really just is solely there to kind of feed our soil life, which in turn then feeds our crops, which in turn feeds us humans. And I like kind of looking at the connection between our soil microbiome and our human microbiome. And we are finding that there are many, many connections that prove that soil health and human health are inseparable. The last point about soil or keeping plant diversity is, as we can see here on this photo, is a beautiful piece of an old sunflower stalk that is being overtaken by a mycorrhiza. So fungi play an important role in agricultural soils for spreading moisture, for connecting the plant root systems, and for really efficiently using micro and macronutrients. And not all plants feed mycorrhizal. Not all plants go into connection with mycorrhizal plants, mycorrhizal fungi. And so, for example, all the plants in the Brassica family, so all of our cabbages, which can, in many vegetable farms, take up a large amount of space, they don't make this connection to mycorrhizal fungi. And one possibility to integrate that is by undersowing our cabbage with plants that do make that connection, or looking that cover crops come in before and after cabbage, so that we have and sustain a healthy fungal population in our agricultural fields. So next slide. We've talked about kind of keeping the ground covered and maximizing the diversity of plants above ground. And the third point is another kind of key, because only a living photosynthesizing plant is actively creating and actively giving off root exudates. And root exudates, the kind of carbohydrates and sugars that the plant has in excess from what it's converted from photosynthesizing and gives off into the soil biome, is basically the food source and the life force for the soil food web. So it's a fine complex system that we are ever more understanding, this connection between plants above ground and their underground interaction with the soil food web. And that's why the living roots, it's great to mulch and it's important to mulch, but if we can do that with a continuous living root, that is even more optimal, because really these living roots are the ones actually doing the active feeding of our soil life. And this is an example of what I was speaking of. This is broccoli with an undersowing of peas, grasses, and clover, which when the broccoli is harvested will then take up the space, so that there's really no point in the season when our soil food life is not being fed. Next slide. So here, another example of an intercrop or undersowing is clovers with wheat. One more example of rye and vetch. So these are not just in grain production, but also, not just in vegetable production, but also in grain production. Very important to try and also there diversify our plant species and get as many different kind of functions working as possible. So we have one more example of intercropping. This is kind of like intercropping deluxe. We have fennel growing on the outside. Tomatoes are coming in the middle. It's a really nice intercropping system where the fennels, at this point, they need a fair amount of space and sun, and they're harvested at the point when the tomatoes then need more space. And so that's kind of the key for intercropping or companion planting, is finding transitions that work for multiple plants so that each plant is getting the sunlight and nutrients that they need at the right amount of time, at the right time. And we have, in addition to those two crops in here, you even see an undersowing then of like buckwheat and phacelia. So kind of a 4 species intercropping. So next slide. So the final principle is, and it's kind of the most basic principle of all, is we really want to just minimize soil disturbance. We really want to keep soil layers intact at all times. So each soil, kind of each bacteria and nematode and all of our soil life players, they have a very specific layer which relates in large part to the amount of oxygen that they need. And that's the layer of soil in which they thrive and can live in. And since bacteria also, for example, they're not very, they kind of glue to one spot and they basically don't move their whole lives. And so if we, every time we're tilling the soil or really changing up all the soil layers, we're also destroying a lot of soil life. because most of our microbiology cannot thrive or even sustain life in a different oxygen level. So we want to minimize soil disturbance as often as possible. And in the next slide, I'd like to show you kind of one succession and this is just kind of an example. We do this with many of our crops, but I just picked out one succession that I really like, where, as you can see on the map, we have, the entire year from October to April, and then it can, October till the April after, so over a year, and it shows the progression. And it just on the first image, what is very obvious is there's always a living root in our soil. And there where there's very, just maybe not as much living root, when the tomatoes come in May, we additionally have a mulched layer. And so this is an example, without going too much into detail, of where one living crop, in this case tomatoes, get planted directly into a living stand of a winter salad crop that can be a spinach or a baby leaf or an Asian salad. And then they're mulched. And when the tomatoes come out, the mulch is just kind of moved aside, and the next winter crop is planted directly in, leaving the tomato roots in. And so it's really a nice example of how we have sustained living roots and covered soil throughout an entire season. So this is kind of what it looks like then in this system in the spring. You can hardly see where the tomatoes are. It kind of looks a little bit wild, unusual for a conventional gardening eye, but beautiful if you're a fan of permaculture and regenerative farming. And we have on the outside, we have beautiful salad heads coming in, and in the middle, all the tomatoes are already planted in 2 rows. The salad heads are then harvested out, and the tomatoes are then mulched and kept covered and take up the space then. And that can be done with many, many different plants, just to give kind of an example. Next slide.
Sorry, Maya, to thank you for giving such an engaging presentation, but I just wanted to tell you we are a little short on time, so we have a tight schedule. Thank you.
Yep. Do you want me to just
speed up a bit?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
So here's what that looks like when the crops are then mulched and the tomatoes need all the space. And this is actually, then we're also coming already to the very last point in the last slides. So agroforestry, without going too much into detail, is kind of one strategy that really unites all of these principles, because we are keeping a biannual crop in the soil. We don't have to disturb, and we are creating really a space where all of those soil organisms that, don't like the soil layers to be mixed up can then find refuge. So there's just 2 slides where it's shown what this looks like. And go through them very quickly. Just rows of fruit and crop trees next to the agricultural fields, creating kind of very important zones where more biodiversity can happen. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
And sorry for interrupting before. Now we have, I think, a short Q&A session. So I would start with a question for you from Giulia Riedo. Is the ground cover a problem for pests? What kind of pest management do you have in place?
So that question is asked often, in particular in relation to mulch and snails. And it's been really interesting to observe that even in crops that we don't mulch, for example, like carrot crops, we're not mulching in between tightly sown carrot crops, we don't find that we have more snails. It's where we have to be very clear about with our pest control is that we keep the edges when we integrate rows of trees in our agricultural fields, is that we have to keep the grass low and mow regularly in between the tree rows, because that seems to be where a lot of our pests come in. And our only pest control that we use on our farm are physical barriers. So we do work with like netting to keep away certain flies and mites.
Thank you. I think Tim Forsland wanted to intervene. Tim?
No, thank you for excellent presentations, both Maya and Laura. It's a pleasure to listen in. I was just wondering if you're through your very encouraging work, have you seen any use of perennials in Europe? I know, for instance, the Land Institute in Kansas, they've worked with making perennial crops where they don't need to till because the roots are in the soil and they produce yields year after year, basically mimicking these prairie-like plants. So I was just wondering if you've experimented or come across any such examples in Europe.
Yeah, we have a trial field right now for it's called like a Stauden rye. So it's a rye that is a perennial. And it's definitely an area that is very fascinating. There's some universities in Germany that are doing some work on that. And I think it's going to be, it should and hopefully will be a more important player in the years to come. Yeah, because it's definitely where we need to be going.
Thank you. I have a question for Laura. What are the concrete actions on climate change adaptation and mitigation options in farming which you are planning to engage policymakers with?
Good question. So policymakers will be engaged, first of all, via our policy briefs, which we plan to write, also policy recommendations at the end of the project. And they are also always invited to our multiplier events, to our events, like the regular events, information events, workshops, etc. This is mostly how we would like to inform and engage policymakers. So more in kind of like an indirect involvement. It's more knowledge transfer and information transfer.
Thank you. And one more question for Maya. What difficulties did you encounter in running the farm at Schloss Tempelhof in the past years that other farmers transition into RegAgri might face? And how did you overcome them?
It's a big question. I think one issue that we faced, which is kind of typical when you start to transition from conventional agriculture, we overtook conventionally worked fields, so fields that had previously been sprayed with pesticides and tilled regularly. And the first years, we definitely had a big issue with a certain weeds, if you put it that way. And I think trusting that the soil microbiome, that it takes time to transition, and trusting that it does transition makes it easier to kind of look at the first year's fields and yields and have that confidence to keep going, because it really is, I mean, it really is a transition for our soils to, you know, go from kind of forced feeding with mineral fertilization to then a more biological solution for feeding. And so I think that having that vision and knowing that it's a normal kind of process is important.
I'm sorry, I was muted. I have a too sensitive keyboard. So this question is for Laura. How can we as a vet center reach out to the RegAgri for Europe project to implement the training for our apprentices, and what steps will it take?
That's a very nice question, because that's what we are actually hoping for. So as vet provider, you have different possibilities how to use the material we have provided. You can either just access the platform and do the course with your learners, but you can also download all the materials or all the modules which are just interested for you. So it's always you're free to use everything we have provided for your own students and learners, and there's no need to ask for permission or anything. You can just download all the PDFs, all the presentations, everything on the platform. However, we can also talk about more specific arrangements and cooperations, and that's then the best way to just contact me directly as project coordinator, and we can see whether there are more ideas or other things you would like to implement. There's also the possibility to maybe, like on the virtual learning environment, to use some of the elements. So that's something we can which can be discussed bilaterally.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you. Thanks to all our speakers for joining us today and for giving us such insightful presentations and answers. Now I give the floor to Antoine Daz.
Thank you, Gaia. I echo your thank yous to all our speakers, all panelists, and also to the audience participants who have been very active in the Q&A session. So thank you very much. I hope this was interesting to you. Maybe as closing words, I would say that we've seen today, as we've heard regenerative agriculture as more than just a technical approach. It's also a philosophy, a holistic approach. It's a social movement. Well, farmer is manager and stewards of the land. The application at large scale of RegAgri would massively contribute to the current environmental and socio-economic problems. But however, we really need a solid policy framework to be able to implement such a philosophy in farming and to change the EU food production systems. And for that, we would need public support. We would need change of cultural mindsets. So maybe one of the closing words of this webinar would be from my side to keep on calling for investment in the education and vocational training of farmers and apprentices, and to keep developing focused approach on systemic agricultural change at all levels. It has to be in organic farming. It has to be changed in the framework laws for sustainable food systems, and also in educational policies at EU and national levels. Thank you very much again for listening. Thank you for the moderation, Gaia. Thanks to all our panelists again. And we hope that you will follow the project closely in its next steps. You can find the recordings of this webinar. You will be able to find them soon on YouTube, and feel free to send them to your networks to talk more about RegAgri in Europe. Thank you. Have a great afternoon. For those who are still there, I'm saying hi to our members in the audience.